Howdy folks, it's Angel the Hunting Gear Guy. I thought I'd do a quick video to kind of compare some of the more common cartridges that you've got out there in hunting rifles for big game. I'm talking deer, elk, moose, that kind of thing. So let's take a closer look at some of these cartridges. And one thing to note is that they'll all do the job. Like literally, if you're talking deer or elk at close range, i.e., like the ranges that they're typically shot at, they're gonna do fine. There's gonna be no practical on-game difference between these. There may be some theoretical difference we're going to talk about in a bit at longer range or with bigger animals and that kind of thing, but literally like all of these will do it at some range. So why don't we just kind of crack straight into it. I'm going to go from least power to most. So we'll start off with the 243. 243 is the smallest cartridge that most people are using for hunting big game, although we'll talk about a couple of other ones as we kind of get into it. But 243 has the smallest diameter bullet. It's got the lowest bullet weight, usually around 100 grains. When you talk about like the muzzle velocity is actually quite high. Usually they're right around 3,000 FPS. I'm going to use box numbers for these just so that they're all the same, but keep in mind your hunting rifle with a shorter barrel might give you less than some of these numbers. Your mileage may vary. So we get a nice screaming fast bullet. Again, it's a 6mm or .243, whatever you want to call it. Diameter bullet, so it's small, it's skinny, it's fast, it keeps its energy pretty far, but it doesn't really have a lot of energy. That's good and bad. The good part of that is that the recoil's very low on these things. 243 is what most youth or recoil sensitive shooters should use, in my opinion, and it's also got a pretty good mean point blank range. Now that's the distance. If we're shooting at a deer and we want to get that bullet inside the vitals, let's say it's going to be a 6-inch diameter circle, we can go +3 or we can go -3. So the bullet can go up and then down. The reason why I'm describing this is you set your scope so that you can keep your reticle dead on and be somewhere in that circle at any point in some zone. So for 243, for example, you can zero them so you have an MPBR of 290 meters or yards, practically the same thing. So practically 300. And all you got to do is point and click. Keep the reticle on the middle there. And if you're close, like say 100 yards, you might be, 2-3 inches high. And if you're a little bit further out, you might be a little bit low, but you'll be inside that vital zone on a deer without having to think about it. So having a good high MPBR is important. All these cartridges practically have the same MPBR though, so not really much to worry about there. Recoil on these things, very low. So 243 has a recoil. There's a couple different ways of measuring it. I'll just use foot-pounds, 10.4. Very low recoil on these things. Maximum deer range. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to say 1,000 foot-pounds of energy. So how far can that bullet go? That 100 grain bullet that I'm using for the 243, how far can that thing go and still carry enough foot-pounds of energy to deliver 1,000 on a target, and has 335 meters for deer. So pretty good. 300, like that's way, most people when they shoot deer, they're inside of 120 meters, somewhere in there, 120, 125 meters, yards, whatever you want to say. Somewhere in there, our 243 is going to do it to 300 fairly reliably. And I've actually shot deer at 300 with a 243, and it worked the same as every other cartridge out there. So that's pretty good. Where it's going to kind of fall short is on elk and moose, because we're going to need a lot more energy on those things. And for elk or moose, really, we're only talking like 150 for the 243. It doesn't have as heavy enough projectile to kind of carry that energy, and it just doesn't deliver as much on the muzzle, which again, our bonus on that is that it's great for recoil-sensitive shooters. Next one up on the list here, this isn't a really common one, but I thought I'd include it anyways. It's 25-06. It's a 30-06 neck down to 25 caliber. So all we're doing there is making the bullet go faster. Because we're using a much lighter bullet, we're going to have a much faster bullet. These things are screaming fast. So this is going to be like one of the higher feet per second or muzzle velocity cartridges that we take a look at. In terms of MPBR, that's also going to help us there, because we're shooting such a fast cartridge that we're not going to drop a lot. So we're looking at right around 310 yards with 25-06. Recoil is not really a lot more. I mean, 16 foot-pounds instead of 10 for the 243, so more. But when you see later on, like that's pretty common. Most of our common cartridges are right around like 15 to 20, somewhere around there. So 16 is fine. But that really increases our max deer range. Now our max deer range out to 480. This is beyond where most people need it. But most importantly on elk, you'd probably want to use like a harder bullet. But on elk or moose, you can go up to 250 with these things. So now we're getting to the point where we can start to, like, that's a more realistic moose shot or elk shot, or especially moose. Sometimes you might see them across a swamp or something like that. So having the ability to send it out a little bit further is nice. After this is a kind of a newer entrant, 6.5 Creedmoor. This one is using not quite a 308 case, but pretty close to a 308 case. We're using a 129 grain bullet. And keep in mind, if you want to compare 6.5 by 55 Swede, it's super similar to this one. It just uses a different case, and otherwise, like ballistically, practically the same. Feet per second is quite a bit less on the 6.5 Creedmoor. It uses a more reasonable velocity. Sometimes those faster cartridges, they can wear out a barrel quite a bit sooner. Not really a super big concern with hunting, but if you are going to do a little bit of target shooting in between, 25-06, for example, would be a poor choice because it would burn out that barrel pretty quickly, whereas some of the slower ones will be better for that. Your MPBR with 6.5 Creedmoor is going to be a little bit less. So instead of the 300 or 310, we're looking at 280. But recoil is also very reasonable at 14 foot-pounds. I'm just using the same stats for all of these. I'll put some of my settings kind of in the little byline so you can see what kind of settings I'm using. The nice thing with using a bit heavier of a bullet and not launching it at Mach 3 plus is that we're getting better range than even those previous ones. So the 6.5 Creedmoor, we can take the deer out to 500, and we can take moose or elk out to 275. So getting some pretty reasonable. And the nice thing, again, with 6.5 Creedmoor, the recoil is not really crazy. Up to 270, we're really going to crank up the recoil here. Practically the same bullet weight, but quite a bit more velocity. So instead of like 2,800, we're going to be around 3,000 feet per second. Our MPBR is going to be around 300 yards. Recoil is going to be around 20. So we've got quite a bit more recoil on the 270 compared to 6.5 or the previous ones we've looked at. But that recoil, actually, like the other bonus part is that we get, again, further energy. Our energy is going to go further out with it. So we're going to be able to take that deer out to 600 and elk, moose, all that kind of stuff out at 380. So quite a bit better there. 7mm 08, this is a 308 neck down to 7mm. It's pretty similar to 6.5 Creedmoor. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but here's the stats on that one if you're curious. It's not really as popular, and really, I don't really see the need for it when you have, like, it's splitting the difference between 6.5 Creedmoor and 308. I would just use one or the other. I don't think there's too much difference in between them. 7mm Rem Mag is very different. Now we're talking about a belted Magnum. What this is going to do is using a 7mm bullet, quite a bit heavier of a bullet than some of our previous cartridges. So typical for 7mm Rem Mag, like a 150 grain bullet, pretty heavy for the caliber. But what that does is, we're going to get a ton of velocity out of it, like 3,000-ish. We're going to get really good ballistics. Our MPBR is going to be around 300. Our recoil is going to be way up there. So instead of the 15 to 20 with those other ones, we're going to do 28.4 foot-pounds of energy of recoil. So lots and lots of recoil on this thing, and lots of range in terms of our lethality. So now we can take a deer out to 780. Not really recommended, but hey, you could. And elk or moose out to 520. So we're doing quite a bit more with that. The next one I wanted to talk about is kind of a lightweight when you compare it to the other ones, but lots of people still use it, and that's the 30-30. It's actually so old that it's 30 caliber, and the cartridge, it could hold 30 grains of black powder. That's how old that thing is. But regardless of all, so it's a fairly low power cartridge. When we talk about 30, I'll use the numbers for 150 grain, because for 170, they're way, way more awful for range and all that kind of stuff. But for 150, our velocity is way slower than everything else. It's right around 2,200, somewhere around there. So it's quite a slow cartridge. And what that means is that we're going to get quite a bit more drop. Our MPBR is now only 204 yards, so quite a bit slower there. Recoil, practically the same thing as the 243, so right around 10 foot-pounds. So very low recoil on these things. But our range, our deer and elk range, not that great. Deer, 180. And again, this kind of plays into, like most 30-30s are like Winchester 94s and Marlin 336s. They're lever guns with iron sights. They're meant to be shot close range. And at close range, they're fine. Even with the low recoil and relatively low performance, they're fine for the distances they're shot at. Close range, they're fine. 180 with a deer. With an elk or moose, you'd really want to go pretty close range. 70 yards is what I calculated out for the 150 grain. Maybe the 170 would carry a little bit better, but not really a lot better. Another kind of take back here, and this one's more common in Canada, is 303 British. I'm including this because there's so many 303s. Every farmer seems to have one. Just for curiosity's sake, if you wanted to know what the difference is between this one and some of the other ones. So the loading that I've got in my chart here is a 150 grain bullet at 2690 feet per second. That'll give us a mean point blank range of 260 yards, which is less than some of the other ones, but it's still not bad. Recoil 16.4, that's all right. And then max deer range 420, but plenty more than we need for that rifle. And max elk or moose range 240. So again, 303 British is great. A lot more power than that 30-30. If you want something with more power, it's definitely got it. 308 is probably the most common one these days. It's probably the most recommended cartridge, and for good reason. It's got a lot of flexibility. 30 caliber cartridges, you can go lighter, you can go heavier bullet for more penetration on elk or moose or that kind of thing. Lighter weight for higher velocity and maybe like a lighter game like deer or something like that. So I've chosen a 150 grain bullet for the ballistics on this one, but you can go with a 165, or if you wanted to do elk or moose, you can go with a 180 grain bullet just as easily, right? Our muzzle velocity is right around 2,800 with that 150 grain bullet. That means that our MPBR is going to be around 278. Recoil is going to be around 18 foot-pounds. So we're getting a little bit higher here. This is getting to where some people would find this a little bit uncomfortable in a lighter rifle. But great terminal ballistics. With deer, we're going to be looking at right around 580 yards, and with elk or moose, we're going to be doing 360. So that's pretty far. 30-06 bumps things up a little bit. So 308 was really like they were trying to take 30-06 and just shorten it and get the same performance out. If you use modern powders, you get more performance. So for 30-06, what I opted to do is to use a 165 grain in the chart here. Keep in mind, if you use a 150, you're going to get better ballistics, but I thought 165 would be interesting, and it also gives a kind of a better blend of raw performance and impact on game and penetration. So when you talk about FPS, it's going to be the same as 308. MPBR is going to be the same. Recoil is going to be up because we're sending a bigger bullet at the same speed. So instead of 18, it's going to be 23 foot-pounds of energy. So quite a bit more recoil on it. That's getting into that uncomfortable zone. Max on deer for this, 680. So this is really getting out there. And max on elk or moose is going to be 440 yards. So 30-06 really does provide quite a bit more performance for longer range lethality. And then lastly, I'm going to end things with 300 Win Mag. 300 short mag may give you less recoil because it burns less powder more efficiently than the 300 mag. But on the other hand, it's frequently in a lighter rifle, which will kick harder. So tomato, let's just talk about the 300 Win Mag. It's typical with that, you'd use like a heavier bullet, like a 180 grain. With a 180 grain, you're still going to be trucking though, right around 3,000 FPS, maybe a bit shorter than that, which will give us a MPBR of around 300 yards. So pretty far with that thing. Recoil off the charts, so somewhere between 30 and 37 foot-pounds of energy on our 300 Win Mag. So it really does kick a lot, and you're not going to want to shoot a bunch at the range with this thing, which may or may not help you, right? Max deer range, 860. Good luck even making contact at that distance, but oh boy. And elk or moose, we're good until 600. So really, if you want to do like long range elk or moose, the 300 Win Mag is, or the 7mm Rem Mag are going to be your jam there. Now, a couple of I'm shooting this in late 2024. There's a couple of cartridges that I think you should look at. One of them is 6.5 PRC. That's starting to show up on newer hunting rifles. It fits a short action like the 6.5 Creedmoor, but it's got more room for more powder, so it sends bullets out faster, usually around 200 FPS faster. It's going to give us better ballistics. 6.5 PRC is a little bit more chonky than the 6.5 Creedmoor, so we're not going to be able to fit as many cartridges in a magazine. Not that it really matters. You only really ever shoot one cartridge at a deer, or at least that's how many you're supposed to shoot, right? Just one shot, one kill. But that's kind of an interesting one to look at. But one thing that I kind of mentioned at the start here, all these cartridges will do it. Keep in mind, average deer is shot at 120 yards. These are not far shots we're taking. All these cartridges will do that. They'll all kill that deer at 120. And really, if you dig into some of the different reports on this, one of the ones that I read was from the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, or DNR. They had a study, I think it was from a wild game farm, where they had like crunch the numbers on hundreds and hundreds of kills on deer, and they found shot placement was the most important thing by far, just by itself. Okay, let's just leave it. Shot placement by far the most important thing. Somewhat important, the bullet type. So a traditional cup and core bullet is just copper outside, lead slug on the inside. Those gave a higher degree of drop dead potential, where you shoot the deer and they just flop over dead. It had nothing to do with the cartridge. Cartridge didn't have anything to do with whether the deer just dropped dead there and then. But shot placement and bullet construction did. Those harder premium bullets gave less drop dead, which some people think like, oh, wow, I pay more for a better bullet. How come they don't just drop dead? Well, those premium bullets usually get better penetration. Think about your Nosler partition, or like some of the copper bullets like the TTSXs or the TSXs and that kind of thing. Those are harder bullets that give more penetration, but they give up doing more damage on the inside as they don't expand or explode or leave fragments behind or anything like that. So some of those lead cup and core bullets will expand really good, will do lots of damage, won't penetrate quite as well, whereas some of the harder premium ones will penetrate better. You want those anyways for a moose or a bigger bodied animal. For a deer, it may not make a difference that much. And keep in mind, like that drop dead, luck of the draw a lot of the time. You might take the same shot on on a different deer. One might drop dead right there. One might run 60 yards into the bush and then die right out there. So really, the cartridge is not, just because you shot it with a 300 Win Mag does not mean it's going to die right there. It may or may not, depending on what happens. One other thing to mention on those copper bullets. So one thing that you can do with the copper bullets is have your cake and eat it too. So with the copper bullets, because they're harder, they don't expand as much, which is a good thing. They're not going to overexpand and that kind of thing. You can get good penetration with a lighter weight copper bullet. Oh, that's interesting. And the other thing that's nice with copper, because it's not quite as dense as lead, in order to make a copper bullet that's the same weight, it needs to be longer, like a javelin kind of a thing. That's going to give better ballistic coefficient. So with some of those copper bullets, instead of running, let's say you need better penetration for a moose or something like that, rather than running a heavy for caliber lead bullet, like cup and core, you can use a lighter copper bullet, still get good penetration, but also get better ballistics. A faster bullet that has better ballistics, maybe less recoil, and you don't have to worry about lead in the wound channel. So it's something that's interesting. I don't personally do a lot of hunting with copper bullets because I have a lot of plain cup and core ones, and I don't usually eat the ribs on the deer anyways, and that's usually the part I hit. Is I'm going for heart and lungs. I hit some ribs. I'm not eating that meat in there anyways, so I don't really care. If you care, you might want to look at a copper bullet because there's those other advantages to it. The big disadvantage with copper bullets is that they're expensive. They're a lot more expensive than the lead ones, so that's something to keep in mind. But regardless what cartridge you choose for Boxing Day, or if you just have one and you're just curious about the different performance, keep in mind at the ranges you're probably going to shoot a deer with, none of this really matters. They'll all do the job and they'll all take that deer. Thanks for watching.